Good morning and happy Friday to those of you who are joining me live today. I'm Anka Novakovic. I run a company called EcoCoach, and we help businesses and organizations become more eco-friendly. Been doing it for 13 years. I love it. I am so grateful that I'm able to do something that I'm passionate about. And today I wanted to talk about something that is hot in terms of larger businesses and that has come across with kind of in conversations with some larger businesses, but that some of you who have smaller businesses or who work in smaller businesses may be wondering whether that's something that you should focus on, and that is science-based targets. And so you have heard of it, of that term, maybe, or maybe you haven't heard of it. Maybe you've implemented some steps at your smaller organizations around sustainability, and then you're thinking, okay, what's the next thing? I've heard about this science-based targets thing. Is that something that I should do? Well, the first question is, of course, what are science-based targets, right? So a lot of the larger organizations are looking at greenhouse gas emissions and reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. And let me get the data correctly, because as always, as I say, my memory isn't all that great anymore. And so I want to make sure that I get the data correctly. So the CDP states that over 80% of the world's 500 largest companies have established emissions reduction or energy specific targets in the 2014 or 2015 financial year, and that's been going up since. So there are greenhouse gas emission targets that are being established by larger organizations, and science-based targets are essentially the next step up. Right. So when you are looking at your carbon footprint, when you're looking at calculating your greenhouse gas emissions, basically science-based targets are those that are aligned and meet the requirements of the Paris Agreement. And so what that means is that you're taking your commitment around reducing your greenhouse gas emissions to the next level. Okay, and so Science-Based Targets is actually an organization that was developed in partnership with a few different organizations. And again, I'm going to read them because, as I mentioned, my memory isn't all that great. So the initiative started, and CDP is part of it, the UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, which is WRI, and WWF. So all of those organizations got together and said, okay, how can we make sure that companies meet the Paris Agreement requirements? And that is where Science-Based Targets came out. So Science-Based Targets is an organization, and you could go to sciencebasedtargets.org and check it out. And it is also the term that we're using for organizations who are interested in kind of stepping up their greenhouse gas reporting. Right, so what are science-based targets? I guess that's the first part. You might be wondering, you might have heard about them, and you might be thinking, okay, well, I don't know if this is for me or not if I don't know what they are. Great question. So science-based target, as I mentioned before, are greenhouse gas emission targets that are in alignment with the Paris Agreement. And what that means is to limit global warming to well below 2% Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Okay? And that is something that obviously is different based on each organization and based on your greenhouse gas emissions. So we're going to go through that, and how. I'm not going to go through how to calculate it. I will definitely tell you where to go to calculate it. So there are 551 companies. Again, I'm referencing this to make sure that I'm getting the numbers correctly. There are 551 companies that are actually participating as part of the Science-Based Targets group, and there are 202 that have approved science-based targets, and these are the larger organizations. And really the main reasons that all the larger organizations cited for doing this is, as you might expect, are related, or maybe you don't, maybe it's a surprise, but are related to finance, right? It's meeting customer expectations, staying ahead of regulation, staying ahead of their competitors, and basically meeting what what their stakeholders are expecting of them, and if they are publicly owned, looking at what investors are expecting of them and meeting those expectations as well. So basically it makes business sense. Again, it's one of those things where if you're looking at sustainability and you're wondering whether you should implement it, as I've said over and over again, and if you've seen other Facebook Lives of mine, I will say it makes business sense. It is something that it has long gone past the nice to have, even with smaller organizations, and there are so many ways that you can do it and you can implement it even if you're a smaller organization that makes sense for you. So what actions does that mean? What do science-based targets mean in terms of the actions that you would be taking as a small business? Well, the first thing is you're going to be calculating your carbon footprint. And so that is really the greenhouse gas emissions, basically mainly carbon dioxide, but other greenhouse gases as well, that your company directly or indirectly emits or is responsible for. So there are 3 scopes for that. You have scope 1, you have scope 2, and you have scope 3, right? Scope 1 is direct emissions. So let's say your company, I know for smaller companies this is kind of a silly example, but if your company owns a jet and you use it for business travel, those emissions are ones that you are responsible for as an organization, right? So anything that is direct, that is directly owned by the company. And if you have, for example, any kind of on-site generation, that could be considered direct as well. Scope 2 is indirect emissions related to electricity. So think about your gas bill, think about your energy bill, right? Things that are indirect, that are not owned by your company, but that you are using. So those are indirect scope 2 emissions. And then scope 3 are also indirect emissions, but they're a lot broader. And so it goes into your supply chain, and it goes into business travel, it goes into teleworking and telecommuting. So as you can imagine, scope 3 can get a little bit hairy. So why would you want to calculate those? Well, you want to make sure that you're looking at what your impact is, right? So for organizations who have gotten to that level, and we'll talk about that in a minute, you will want to be looking at scope 1 and scope 2, and then ideally delving into scope 3. For science-based targets, what that means is that you will have scope 1 and scope 2 down, and that you will also look at the scope 3 emissions from your value chain, right? Because if you don't have those, it's not considered a value target, a valid target for a science-based target. So that gets a little bit complicated, as you can imagine, if you're a smaller business and you're kind of thinking about day to day, oh my God, I've got to put out fires. Thinking about your carbon emissions and thinking about up and down the value chain might be a little bit rough to do. So the next question, of course, is, okay, I'm a small business. I'm a small business owner. I'm a small business manager. I'm even a small business, like a sustainability champion within a small business. Does it make sense to even promote this, to look at this? And I have come up with 3 criteria to kind of think about this and see if it makes sense for you. And to be fair, and just I'll say this up front, it takes a lot of work to get those science-based targets. It takes some work to get a carbon footprint, but it takes a lot more work to get the science-based targets. So there are 3 things that I would say, 3 criteria that I would say you'd want to meet if you're actually looking at that. First, what I'm calling your sustainability IQ, right? So where do you stand around sustainability with your organization? Have you just started out? Have you kind of gotten rid of the low-hanging fruit and then you just started a couple different projects? Do you have sustainability completely implemented as part of your strategy, as part of your organizational culture? If yes, then I would say your sustainability IQ is pretty high, and so this is something that you might want to consider. The second thing that you'll want to look at is metrics. Do you have the metrics in place that are tracking everything that you're doing, right? So if there are items in scope 1, so direct emissions, that your organization is responsible for, ideally you would have the metrics and you'd be tracking those. You would have the information for that. And so if you have that information, then again, the answer is yes, think about science-based targets. And the third is resources, right? Resources meaning someone on your staff who can devote time into this, someone who can analyze it, or if you want to hire it out and kind of bring a consultant on board, you can also do that. And I believe Science-Based Targets actually now offers that option to kind of help businesses with it. And I don't know too much about it. So if you have those resources, because here's the thing, right? Scope 1 and Scope 2, based on that definition that I mentioned, are pretty simple, and it's things that you can pretty easily get, and it's pretty straightforward. Scope 3 can get pretty hairy, and you've got to get into the nitty-gritty, and not only that, but then you kind of have to look at your value chain, right? And so getting the data for your value chain and then figuring out a target that makes sense. So if you want to actually set a science-based target and you want to be considered part of these organizations that are taking action, you have to send out a commitment letter. You have to do the calculation and provide a potential target, and then they have to validate it. And obviously after that, you want to meet that target, right? So it's a lot of work. So if you're a small business and you have limited resources, if you have sustainability completely implemented, if you have the metrics in place, and if you have the resources to do it, then I would say definitely go ahead. Unfortunately, I think for most small businesses, and this is the reality of day to day, that's not where they're at. And they still have a lot of work to do around even implementing a first sustainability project, or even recycling. And that's okay as well. I would just urge you to get started. Don't wait. This is becoming the norm. If science-based targets are getting implemented by larger organizations, then they're going to come for smaller organizations. There might be a simpler version of it, but they will come here as well for smaller organizations. So I urge you to kind of think about your sustainability initiative, think about what you want to do. And as always, check out the blog. I have a blog that matches this and gives you a little bit more detail on the EcoCoach website. It's www.eco-coach.com. And we also have a free sustainability checklist if you want to kind of take a look and see how you're doing against what, kind of a starter point around sustainability. Definitely go check it out. Again, it's eco-coach.com. Thanks so much for watching, and here's to your sustainability success. Have a great day.